So we're going to continue with Stargirl. This is chapter 27. So we'll read 27, 28, and 29. Chapter 27. And our best wishes go with you, Susan Caraway. The PA announcement echoed through the school lobby, and we were off to Phoenix. The driver was Mr. McShane, Micah High's faculty representative to the state contest. Susan and I sat in the back. Susan's parents were driving their own car and would meet us in Phoenix. As we pulled out of the parking lot, she wagged a finger in my face. Don't get a big head, mister. I was only allowed to invite 2 friends along. You weren't the only one I asked. Who was the other? I said. Dory. Well, then, I said, I think I'll go for the big head. Dory isn't another guy. She grinned. No, she's not one of those. Suddenly, she unbuckled her seatbelt. We each had a back window. Mr. McShane, she announced, I'm moving over so I can sit close to Leo. He is so cute, I can't help myself. In the rearview mirror, the teacher's eyes crinkled. Whatever you like, Susan, it's your day. She slid over and fastened herself into the middle belt. She jabbed me. Hear that? It's my day. I get whatever I want. So I said, what happened when you asked Dory Dilson? She said no. She's mad at me. I could tell. Ever since I became Susan, she thinks I betrayed myself. She just doesn't understand how important it is to be popular. I wasn't sure what to say to that. I was feeling a little uneasy. Fortunately, wondering what to say wasn't much of a problem for me during that 2-hour ride, because Susan chattered away like old Stargirl the whole time. But I know Dory, she said, and I'll tell you one thing. What's that? She'll be in the front of the mob cheering for me when we get back tomorrow. I later found out that after we left the school, the principal had spoken again on the PA. He had announced our expected time of return on Saturday and suggested that everyone be on hand to meet us, win or lose. Losing, as it turned out, never occurred to the contestant herself. Would you do a favor for me? She said. I told her sure. That big silver plate that goes to the winner, I'm such a klutz with dishes at home. Would you hold it for me when the crowd rushes in? I'm afraid I'll drop it. I stared at her. What crowd? What rush? In the school parking lot when we get back tomorrow. There's always a crowd waiting for the returning hero. Remember the film at school? My vision? She cocked her head and peered into my eyes. She rapped my forehead with her knuckle. Hello in there. Anybody home? Oh, I said, that crowd. She nodded. Exactly. Course, we'll be safe as long as we're in the car. But once we get out, who knows what will happen? Crowds can get pretty wild, right, Mr. McShane? The teacher nodded. So I hear. She never spoke to me as if instructing she spoke to me as if instructing a first grader. Leo, this has never happened in Micah before, having a winner of the Arizona State Rhetorical Contest. One of their very own. When they hear about it, they're going to go bananas. And when they get a gander at me and that trophy, she rolled her eyes and whistled. I just hope they don't get out of hand. The police will keep them in line, I said. Maybe they'll call out the National Guard. She stared, wide-eyed. You think? She didn't realize I was kidding. Well, she said, I'm really not afraid for myself. I wouldn't mind a little jostling. Do you think they'll jostle, Mr. McShane? In the mirror, he shifted his eye to us. Never can tell. And if they want to carry me around on their shoulders, that's okay too, but they better not. She poked me with her finger. Better not mess with my trophy. That's why you, another poke, are going to hold it tight. I wished Mr. McShane would say something. Susan, I said, did you ever hear of counting your chickens? Before they hatch, you mean? Exactly. I hear you're not supposed to. Exactly. She nodded thoughtfully. Never made much sense to me. I mean, if you know they're going to hatch, why not count them? Because you can't know. I said, there's no guarantees. I hate to break this to you, but you're not the only person in the contest. Somebody else could win. You could lose. It is possible. She thought about that for a moment, and then she shook her head. Nope, not possible. So, she threw up her arms and smiled hugely. Why wait to feel great? Celebrate now, that's my motto. She nuzzled into me. What's yours, big boy? Don't count your chickens. I said. She shuddered mockingly. Ooh, you're such a poop, Leo. What's your motto, Mr. McShane? Drive carefully, he said. You may have a winner in the car. That set her off howling. Mr. McShane, I said, you're not helping. Sorry, he lied. I just looked at her. You're going to be in a state contest. Aren't you a little bit nervous? The smile vanished. Yes, I am. I'm a lot nervous. I just hope things don't get out of hand when we get back to school. I've never been adored by mobs of people before. I'm not sure how I'm going to react. I hope I don't get a big head. Do you think I'm the big head type, Mr. McShane? I raised my hand. Can I answer that? I think your head is just fine, said the teacher. She jabbed me with her elbow. Hear that, Mr. Know-it-all? She gave me her smug face, which promptly disappeared as she thrust up her arms and yelped. They're going to love me. Mr. McShane wagged his head and chuckled. Silently, I gave up. She pointed out the window. Look, even the desert is celebrating. It seemed to be true. The normally dull cacti and scrub were splashed with April colors as if a great painter had passed over the landscape with a brush, dabbing yellow here, red there. Susan strained against her seatbelt. Mr. McShane, can we stop here just for a minute, please? When the teacher hesitated, she said, You said it's my day. I get whatever I want. The car coasted to a stop along the gravelly roadside. In a moment, she was out the door, bounding across the desert. She skipped and whirled and cartwheeled among the prickly natives. She bowed to a yucca, waltzed with a saguaro. She picked a red blossom from a barrel cactus and fixed it in her hair. She practiced her smile, and her nod, and her wave, one hand, two hand, to the adoring mob at her hero's welcome. She snapped a needle from the cactus and with the slapstick pantomime of a circus clown, pretended to pick her teeth with it. Mr. McShane and I were leaning on the car laughing when suddenly she stopped, cocked her head, and stared off in another direction. She stayed like that, stone still, for a good 2 minutes, then abruptly turned and came back to the car. Her face was thoughtful. Mr. McShane, she said as the teacher drove off, do you know any extinct birds? Passenger pigeon, he said. That's probably the best known. They say there used to be so many of them that they were dark in the sky when they flew over. And the moa. Moa? Huge bird. Like a condor, I said. He chuckled. The condor wouldn't have even come up to its knee. Make an ostrich look small. 12, 13 feet tall, maybe the biggest bird ever. Couldn't fly. Lived in New Zealand. Died out hundreds of years ago. Killed off by people. Half their size, said Susan. Mr. McShane nodded. Wrote a report about moas in grade school. I thought they were the neatest things. Susan's eyes were glistening. Did moas have a voice? The teacher thought about it. I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows. Susan looked out the window at the passing desert. I heard a mockingbird back there, and it made me think of something Archie said. Mr. Brubaker? Said Mr. McShane. Yes. He said he believes mockingbirds may do more than imitate other birds. I mean other living birds. He thinks that they may also imitate the sound of birds that are no longer around. He thinks the sound of extinct birds are passed down the years from mockingbird to mockingbird. Interesting thought, said Mr. McShane. He says when a mockingbird sings, for all we know, it's pitching fossils into the air. He says who knows what songs of ancient creatures we may be hearing out there. The words of Archie Brubaker settled over the silence in the car. As if reading my thoughts, Mr. McShane turned off the air conditioner and powered down the windows. Hair blew in a faint, smoky scent of mesquite. After a while, I felt the touch of Susan's hand. Her fingers wove through mine. Mr. McShane, she cooed, we're holding hands in the back seat. Uh-oh, he said. Hormonal teenagers. Don't you think he's cute, Mr. McShane? I never really thought about it, said the teacher. Well, look, she said. She grabbed my face in her hand and pulled it forward. The teacher's eyes considered me briefly in the rearview mirror. You're right. He's adorable. Susan released my blushing face. Told you. Don't you just love him? I wouldn't go that far. A minute later, Mr. McShane. Now I felt something in my ear. I'm putting my finger in his ear. This sort of silliness went on until we rounded a mesa and saw the brown mist on the horizon. that announced our approach to the city of Phoenix. Chapter 28. Her parents met us in the lobby of the hotel where Susan, Mr. McShane, and I each had a room for the night. After we checked in, the 5 of us ate a buffet lunch in the hotel restaurant. Then we watched Susan board a bus that would take her and 18 other contestants to the Phoenix West High School. There were 38 contestants. 19 had already given their speeches that morning. By the end of the afternoon, 10 finalists would be chosen. The finals would take place that evening. To be honest, none of us was surprised that Susan made the cut. She was incredibly good. The surprise was this: her speech was new. It was not the one she'd given at the Micah High, and it was not the one she'd been practicing for weeks in front of me and Peter Sinkowitz and assorted saguaros. It was not the one I had heard just the day before, but it was wonderful. There were some elements of the old speech in it, and that was much that was as new as that morning. Like a butterfly, her words fluttered from image to image. She swung from the distance past Barney, Archie's Paleocene rodent skull, to the present, Cinnamon, to the distant future, the death of the sun. From the most ordinary here, the old man nodding off on the bench at Tudor Village, to the most extraordinary there, a newly discovered galaxy 90% to the end of the universe. She touched on silver lunch trucks, and designer labels, and enchanted places. And when she said her best friend gave her pet rat a ride on his shoulder, tears came to my eyes. It was a jumble, it was a mishmatch, and somehow she pulled it all together. Somehow she threaded every different thing through the voice of a solitary mockingbird singing in the desert. She called her speech, "I Might Have Heard a Moa." The auditorium was half full, mostly with small groups of students and parents from the competing schools. After a contestant finished, his or her supporters whispered and whistled and whooped, as if doing so would influence the judges. The rest was polite applause. When Susan was finished, the 4 of us managed a modest cheer, but that was about it. No whistles, no whoops. I think we were made of more timid stuff than the speechmaker herself. Back at the hotel, Mr. McShane and I mobbed her, if two can be a mob. Her parents were more reserved. They were full of smiles and well-dones, but they seemed no more surprised at her success than Susan did. When the adults went off to the gift shop, I had her to myself, and I said, "Where did that come from?" She grinned. "Did you like it?" "Sure, but it's not what we've been hearing for the last month. What were you doing, practicing a secret speech on the side?" "Nope. That was the first time I heard it, too." I stared at her. Slowly her words sank in. "Let me get this straight. You were saying you just made it up this morning?" "I'm saying I didn't even make it up. It was just there. All I did was open my mouth and let it out." She held both hands out to me and snapped her fingers. Presto. I gaped at her. "What are you going to say tonight?" She threw out her arms. "Who knows?" The 5 of us ate an early dinner in the hotel restaurant. Afterward, we waited in the lobby while Susan changed clothes. She stepped off the elevator wearing a peach-colored pantsuit. She slinked across the lobby, modeling for us. She sat on her mother's lap and said, "My personal seamstress made it for me." We applauded lightly and sent her off on the bus. The general public was invited to the evening show, and the auditorium was packed. People stood in the back. Down front, a high school orchestra played arousing music by John Philip Sousa. The 10 contestants sat on stage. 7 were boys. All the contestants appeared to be grim and nervous, stiff as mannequins, except for Susan, who was bending the ear of a boy sitting next to her. He nodded occasionally, but kept his eyes and spine at attention and obviously wished she would shut up. Susan's parents chuckled knowingly at her behavior, while I tried to disguise a stab of jealousy. One by one, the contestants took the long walk to the center stage to give their speeches. The applause was equally hearty for all. A grade school girl in a frilly white dress handed each contestant a bouquet of roses, yellow for the girls and red for the boys. While the girls cradled the roses, the boys looked at them as if they were hand grenades. Susan was next to last to speak. When her name was called, she bounced up from her chair and practically ran to the microphone. She did a sprightly pirouette, a curtsy, waved her hand in a window washer motion, and said, "Hi!" Accustomed to seeing stiff, mortified contestants, the audience responded with uncertain titters. They didn't know what to make of this unconventional teenager any more than we had on the first day of school. Several bold souls said hi and waved back. She did not begin, at least not in the usual sense. There was no ringing preamble. She merely stood there comfortably chatting away as if we were all on rocking chairs on her front porch. Murmur drifted toward the ceiling. People were waiting for her to get started. The murmur subsided as it occurred to them that this was it, and they were missing it. The quiet that fell over the auditorium was absolute. I was more tuned into the audience than to the speaker, and if for the last 5 minutes of her talk anyone was breathing, I could not detect it. When she finished with barely a whisper, "Can you hear it?" and leaned with her cupped hand to her ear, 1,500 people seemed to inch forward, straining to hear. There were 10 seconds of purest stillness. Then she turned abruptly and went back to her chair. Still there was no reaction. "What's going on, I wonder?" She sat forward in her chair, her hands folded primly in her lap. And then it came, suddenly, explosively, as if everyone had awakened at once. They were all on our feet, clapping and shouting and whistling. I found myself sobbing. The cheering was as wild as that of the crowd at the championship basketball game. Chapter 29. She won, of course, as she said she would. The silver plate they gave her twinkled like a starburst in the galaxy of flashing cameras. 2 TV crews watched her in lights and interviewed her backstage. Strangers mobbed her, citizens of Phoenix gushing, telling her they had been coming to the contest for years, and they had never heard anything like it. School children thrust programs into her face for autographs. Every parent wanted her for a daughter, and every teacher for a student. She was so happy. She was so proud. She yelped and cried when she saw us. She hugged each of us in turn, and I thought she would squeeze the breath out of me. Back at the hotel, everyone already seemed to know. The doorman, the desk manager, the people in the lobby, the elevator. Suddenly she had this magical, wonderful power. Whoever laid eyes on her smiled, and the English language dwindled to a single word, repeated over and over: "Congratulations." We walked, we floated, around the block to burn off our excess energy. Back at the hotel, we were invited to the nightclub, even though Susan and I were underage. We drank ginger ales and ordered jalapeno poppers, and we all danced to a country and western band while Susan's face beamed on the late news from the TV above the bar. The dance floor was the only place where she did not carry her silver plate. The first thing the next morning, there she was, sliding under the door of my hotel room, her picture on the front page of the Arizona Republic. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it, pride welling in me. I read the story. It called her speech mesmerizing, hypnotic, and mysteriously touching. I pictured folded morning papers tossed from cars, landing on driveways all over Micah. We all met for the breakfast buffet. People stared and nodded and smiled and silently lip said congratulations across the restaurant. We headed home in a 2-car caravan. For a while, Susan was her usual chatty self. She put the silver plate on the front seat beside Mr. McShane. She told him it would ride next to him for a whole 10 minutes, and he could touch it all he wanted. This was his reward, she said, for telling her about Moas. And soon as the 10 minutes were up, she took back the plate. As we drew nearer to town, the chatter subsided and finally stopped. We rode the last miles in silence. She took my hand. The nearer we came, the harder she squeezed. When we hit the outskirts of town, she turned to me and said, "Do I look okay?" I told her she looked great. She didn't seem to believe me. She held up the silver plate and studied her reflection. She turned to me again and looked at me for some time before she spoke. "I've been thinking. This is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to hold on to the plate myself, okay?" I nodded. Until they lift me onto their shoulders, then I'll give it to you. Understand?" I nodded. "So stay next to me every second. Crowds can separate you, you know. They'll do that, okay?" I nodded. Okay. Her hand was hot and sweating. We drove past a man in his driveway. He was dipping a large broom-like brush into a pail and painting the asphalt with black sealer. He was bent intently to his work in the noonday sun, and somehow I knew at that moment what would happen. I could see it. I wanted to shout to Mr. McShane, "No, don't turn. Don't go in there." But he did turn. He turned. And there was a school in front of us, and never in my life have I seen a place so empty. No banners, no people, no cars. "Probably around back," Mr. McShane said. His voice was hoarse. "Parking lot." We swung around the back to the parking lot, and yes, there was a car, and another car, and people, 3 of them, shading their eyes in the sun, watching us. 2 of them were teachers. The other was a student, Dory Dilson. She stood apart from the teachers, alone in the back shimmering sea of asphalt. As we approached, she held up a sign, a huge cardboard sign bigger than a basketball backboard. She set the sign on the edge and propped it up, erasing herself. The red painted letters said, "Way to go, Susan. We're proud of you." The car stopped in front of it. All that was left to see of Dory Dilson were 2 sets of fingers holding the sides of the sign. We were close enough now to see the sign was trembling, and I knew that Dory was crying. There was no confetti, no kazoos, nothing cheered, not even a mockingbird. So that ends our reading for today.